The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it already knew what it was about to take from me. I remember the sound first, the faint scratch of the pen in my daughter-in-law's hand as she slid the folder across my kitchen table. The same table where I used to help my son with his homework, where I signed his college forms, where I once wrote checks to keep this very house standing. She smiled when she did it. Not a cruel smile. Worse, polite one. "Just need your signature here, Mom," she said softly. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. Before that afternoon, my life had settled into a rhythm I trusted. Not exciting, not grand, but steady. The kind of steady you earn after decades of showing up for other people. I woke every morning at 5:30, even though I didn't need to anymore. Habit is a stubborn thing. I'd make coffee in the old percolator, strong the way my late husband liked it, and sit by the window while the neighborhood came to life. The same mailman, the same barking dog 2 houses down, the same cracked sidewalk my son used to trip over when he was little. This house wasn't fancy, but it was mine, or at least I thought it was. I bought it 32 years ago with my husband, back when interest rates were high and money was tight. We painted the walls ourselves, argued over carpet colors, planted a maple tree in the front yard that now shaded the whole porch. When my husband passed, the house became more than shelter, became proof. Proof that I'd survived something that nearly hollowed me out. When my son married Lila, I welcomed her in the way I believed good mothers-in-law were supposed to. Cooked for her, gave her space, never questioned her decisions, even when they didn't sit right with me. I told myself love was flexible, that families change shape. After the wedding, they moved in temporarily. That word stretched longer than anyone admitted. Rent was high, they said. Savings were thin. Understood. I always did. I paid the property taxes, the insurance, the repairs. When the roof leaked, I wrote the check. When the furnace died, I took money out of my retirement account without telling anyone. I told myself this was what mothers did. We absorbed pressure quietly so our children didn't have to feel it. Lila was polite. Always polite. She called me Mom from the beginning, though it never sounded natural on her tongue. She reorganized my kitchen within a month. Changed where I kept my spices, replaced my dish towels, donated my old mugs without asking. Small things. Harmless, I told myself. My son, Daniel, stayed neutral. Or at least I thought he did. He avoided eye contact when disagreements hovered in the air. He laughed things off. He said, "You two will figure it out." That was Daniel's favorite sentence. The first real shift came quietly. Lila started taking phone calls outside. Stepping onto the porch, lowering her voice, glancing back through the screen door like she was checking whether I could hear her. When I asked if everything was okay, she smiled and said, "Just paperwork stuff. Boring adult things. Paperwork." Then the mail began arriving addressed to both of them. Thick envelopes. Legal-looking ones. I never opened them. I never even asked. I trusted too easily because I wanted peace more than truth. The day she asked me to sign the papers, she made tea first. Chamomile. She knew I liked chamomile when my nerves were bad. "Daniel's at work," she said, setting the mug down carefully in front of me. "But he knows I'm talking to you." That should have been my second warning. She explained it like a favor. Something about refinancing. About cleaning up some technicalities. She talked about interest rates and future planning, about how this would protect everyone. I didn't read the papers at first. I trusted the tone of her voice. I trusted the fact that my son's name was mentioned like a shield. But then my eyes caught a phrase. Vacate the premises. I asked her to repeat herself. "Oh," she said lightly, as if she'd just remembered to mention salt in a recipe. "It's just standard language. Lawyers put that in everything." I looked closer. My hand started to shake, not dramatically, just enough that the pages rustled. The document wasn't about refinancing. It wasn't about protection. It was an eviction notice. My name was there. My signature line at the bottom. 30 days. "You're removing me from my own home," I said, the words landing between us like broken glass. She didn't deny it. Daniel came home an hour later. He didn't shout. Didn't apologize. He sat across from me, hands clasped, eyes heavy with something that looked like guilt but felt more like inconvenience. "We thought this would be easier," he said. That was when I understood. They hadn't made a mistake. They had made a plan. I didn't cry. Not then. He nodded. I said I needed time to think. I said I'd read the papers more carefully. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house breathe around me. The creak in the hallway. A ticking clock. The maple branches brushing against the window like they always had. They thought I was weak because I was quiet. They were wrong. I didn't sign anything. I started planning my exit, on my terms. The next morning I woke before the sun the way I always had. But this time the quiet felt different. Thicker. Like the house was holding its breath. I moved slowly through the kitchen, touching things without realizing I was doing it. The edge of the counter where Daniel once chipped his tooth. The drawer that stuck unless you lifted it just right. The faint smell of lemon cleaner mixed with old wood. I'd lived long enough to know when something familiar was about to become memory. At breakfast, Lila acted normal. That was the part that unsettled me the most. She talked about groceries, about a neighbor's new car, about how expensive everything was getting. Daniel nodded along, scrolling on his phone. They didn't ask if I'd slept well. They didn't ask what I thought about the papers. They assumed silence meant surrender. After Daniel left for work, Lila stacked the dishes with exaggerated care. Then she turned to me. Her hands folded neatly in front of her like she was about to give a presentation. "So," she said, "did you get a chance to look everything over?" I met her eyes. Only. Too calmly I think it made her blink. "I did," I said. "I'll need a few days." Her smile tightened. "Of course. We just don't want to miss any deadlines." Deadlines. For my removal. I spent that afternoon in my room, not crying, not packing, thinking. I replayed the last few years in my mind, looking for the moment this had shifted from family to transaction. It hadn't happened all at once. Never does. It happens in permissions given too easily. Boundaries blurred because love tells you not to be difficult. I pulled out the old filing box from my closet. The one I hadn't opened since my husband passed. The tax records, insurance policies, everything I'd signed, paid, and saved. That was when I found it. A copy of the deed, still in my name. I sat on the edge of the bed, the paper resting on my knees, my heart pounding in my ears. The house hadn't been transferred. Not legally. Not fully. Somewhere along the way, they'd assumed paperwork replaced truth. Or maybe they hoped I wouldn't notice. The next few days I played the role they expected. I moved quietly. I agreed vaguely. I didn't challenge anything. Lila mistook my composure for compliance, and that gave me something valuable. Time. Time to call a lawyer. His office smelled like old books and burnt coffee. He listened without interrupting, which told me more than anything he said afterward. "They can't evict you," he said finally. "Not without ownership. And they don't have it." I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief. Clarity. "But," he added, "they can make your life uncomfortable. And it sounds like they already have." He was right. That night the thermostat was turned down low. Too low. Lila claimed it was an accident. The next morning my laundry was moved mid-cycle, left damp in a basket. Another accident. These weren't attacks. They were nudges. Reminders that I was no longer welcome. Daniel avoided me completely. When we crossed paths, he spoke to the wall over my shoulder. He had already rehearsed his version of this story. The one where he was practical, not cruel. Efficient, not disloyal. I realized then that confronting him wouldn't bring closure. It would only give him a chance to rewrite history out loud. So instead I began preparing. Not just legally but emotionally. I sorted through old photo albums, deciding which memories I would carry with me and which could stay behind. I donated clothes I no longer needed. I cooked meals and froze portions, labeling them carefully. Small acts of control in a situation designed to strip it away. Lila noticed. Course she did. You're taking this really well, she said one evening, watching me seal a box. Smiled back. I've had a lot of practice letting go. That unsettled her. Could tell. The tension peaked the day Daniel asked carefully if I'd found somewhere to stay. Not yet, I said. But I will. He nodded, relieved. Not because he cared where I went, but because my departure was now inevitable in his mind. That was when I decided it was time. I invited them both to sit down that Sunday afternoon. I made pot roast, Daniel's favorite. I set the table the way I always had. Cloth napkins, proper silverware, water glasses aligned just so. Familiarity is disarming. Halfway through the meal, I placed a folder on the table. I had some paperwork of my own, I said. Daniel froze. Lila reached for the folder, then stopped herself. Inside were copies of the deed, the bank statements, a letter from my lawyer. I watched their faces change as they read. This house is still legally mine, I said gently. And any attempt to remove me without consent would be unlawful. Lila's voice sharpened. You're threatening us. No, I said. I'm informing you. Daniel looked up, finally meeting my eyes. Why are you doing this? The question stunned me. I'm doing this, I said slowly, because you forgot who paid for this home. And because you assumed my silence meant weakness. The room went quiet. Even the clock seemed to pause. I will be leaving, I continued. But not because you told me to. Because I choose to. Neither of them spoke. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The next morning, the house felt lighter. Strange, considering the tension that had filled every corner. I moved through it like a shadow, touching surfaces I had almost forgotten were mine. The maple tree outside swayed gently in the wind, brushing the window panes with a soft, familiar rhythm. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of calm. I began the preparations quietly. Boxes stacked neatly in the living room, labeled with precise care. Kitchen, fragile. Books, family only. Clothes, seasonal. I knew exactly what I wanted to take with me and what I could leave behind. Not everything needed to follow. The house itself could keep some memories, let go of the rest. Lila noticed. Course she did. She hovered, asking questions disguised as casual curiosity. Do you need help? She asked one morning, eyes bright, hands clasped politely. I smiled softly, pouring tea into my favorite chipped cup. No, thank you. I've got this. Her polite insistence irritated me less than I expected. Perhaps she thought she could intimidate me, push me into haste. Instead, I had learned that composure was a weapon she could not see. I didn't need anger. I didn't need shouting. I only needed clarity. I started to speak with neighbors more often. Casual conversation at first, asking about mail when I was away, sharing small talk over fences, but I subtly gleaned details about their awareness of Lila and Daniel's activities. People notice things. People always notice things. I listened quietly, storing information I would need later. Every step I took was deliberate, measured. I avoided confrontation because I knew they thrived on it. Drama was their battlefield. I preferred strategy. A week later, I received a call from a lawyer I had consulted previously. He had uncovered additional documents Lila had submitted without my knowledge, attempting to place limitations on my access to the property. The papers were invalid, but the fact they existed confirmed one thing. They believed I would not act. They underestimated you, the lawyer said plainly. They assumed fear or compliance. Smiled. Not for him but to myself. Yes, they had underestimated me. And that had been their first mistake. That evening I sat down with my son in the living room. The air was thick with unspoken words, the faint scent of dinner lingering in the kitchen. I didn't rush. I let the silence stretch, letting him feel its weight. Daniel, I began carefully, you've made a choice. I've seen it. And I've seen your assumptions about me. He shifted uncomfortably. Mom, I am leaving, I said softly, almost tenderly. But I am not being removed. I am leaving because I want to. And I will leave on my own terms. His jaw tightened. I could see the realization in his eyes, the uncomfortable recognition that I was no longer the person who could be pushed aside. You don't understand, he said. We were trying to manage everything. We thought. You assumed silence meant weakness, I interrupted gently. And that assumption nearly cost you respect. Daniel's voice faltered. I didn't think. You didn't think, I echoed. Because you never had to before. You forgot that I built this life, that I protected this home, that I carried this family through storms you cannot even begin to remember. His face paled. For the first time in years, I saw his vulnerability, the boy I raised, stripped of his rehearsed confidence. Lila appeared then, her expression tight but polite. Mom, this is unnecessary. We just wanted. No, I said quietly but firmly. This is necessary. You need to understand that there are consequences for assuming others will step aside silently. I watched her carefully, noting the slight trembling of her hands, the stiffness in her shoulders. She had rehearsed this moment, practiced her calm demeanor. But no amount of practice could erase the truth she had buried in polite smiles. The conversation ended without shouting, without tears. Not because the danger had passed, but because I had reclaimed control. They realized that I was no longer reacting. I was acting. On my timeline, in my terms. Over the next 2 weeks, I began moving my belongings into a small apartment I had reserved quietly. The boxes went in slowly, deliberately. I labeled, sorted, and packed. I refused to let anger dictate pace. Each item that left the house felt like a thread of autonomy being rewoven into my life. The maple tree outside whispered against the window one last time as I closed the door on my familiar kitchen. Neighbors watched politely, curious but cautious. A few offered help, and I accepted with a simple smile and thanks. Small gestures, human warmth. Not drama. Not revenge. Strength. The final night in the house, I wandered through each room slowly. My fingers traced the edges of counters, the backs of chairs, the grooves in the wooden floor. Memories lingered in the air. The laughter of Daniel as a child, the scent of Sunday roasts, the quiet conversations with my husband by candlelight. I did not cry. I let the house keep its history. I needed only the lessons, not the grief. On moving day, Daniel and Lila were present, silent. They understood finally that their plan had failed, not because I fought loudly or angrily, but because I had quietly and deliberately reclaimed my autonomy. They handed me boxes. They made no excuses. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing beyond the polite facades they always wore. But I didn't need that. Their recognition of my agency was enough. As I drove away from the house, boxes secured in the back, I noticed the sunlight through the maple branches. A momentary warmth touched my chest. The house was no longer a cage. It was simply what it had always been. A home I built, memories stored, lessons learned. I was free, not in bitterness, but in quiet clarity. The first night in my new apartment, the silence felt different, less like a void and more like a space I could finally breathe in. No creaks that reminded me of intrusions, no polite smiles hiding sharp edges. Just air, walls, and the faint scent of fresh paint. I unpacked slowly, deliberately. The process became meditative. I placed my favorite mugs in the kitchen cabinet, arranged books on the shelves, and draped blankets over the sofa in a way that felt intentional, comforting. Everything was mine. Every small choice reflected me. It was remarkable how empowering such ordinary actions could feel after weeks of betrayal and uncertainty. That evening I sat on the balcony, a cup of tea in hand. The city hummed below, distant, alive. I felt a tremor of grief, not for the house, but for the loss of trust one had assumed would never be broken. I closed my eyes and let it settle. The tremor faded into a quiet sense of resolve. I thought of Daniel and Lila. I didn't hate them, not fully. Betrayal is messy, people are messy. I understood that they acted out of self-interest and fear. That didn't excuse their behavior, but it helped me release the fury I could have clung to. Strength, I realized, wasn't about making them suffer. It was about ensuring they no longer controlled my life. 2 weeks later, I returned briefly to the old house. Not to reclaim it. Legally it still belonged to me, but to close chapters. I walked through the rooms one last time, pausing to touch surfaces and feel memories settle. The maple tree in the front yard swayed in the wind, branches brushing lightly against the windows. I breathed it in. The house had held my life for decades, and I was ready to let it continue without me. Neighbors peeked from windows or waved from driveways. I smiled at a few familiar faces, no words exchanged, just acknowledgement. The community had noticed the tension over the past weeks. Whispers had circulated, rumors, assumptions, quiet speculation. But I no longer needed their validation. My peace wasn't tied to their opinions. I left the keys on the counter, folded neatly with a note. The house is yours to occupy, not to claim. Treat it as you would any guest in another's home. No venom. No demands. Just dignity. Returning to my apartment, I began rebuilding daily routines. I joined a local book club, something I had always wanted but never prioritized. I cooked meals that reminded me of my mother, experimenting with flavors that Daniel never appreciated. I walked in the evenings, watching sunsets, listening to the city's subtle rhythms. Slowly, a new pattern emerged. Not a replacement for what I lost, but a separate life grounded in autonomy and peace. Communication with Daniel and Lila became minimal. Occasional texts regarding family matters or updates on shared obligations. Each interaction was measured, controlled. I refused to be drawn into argument or manipulation. Their awareness of my boundaries became clear over time, and eventually, I think they understood that I was unshakable. One afternoon, a letter arrived from a lawyer representing Lila's family. The tone was cautious, almost apologetic. They had assumed I would cave, that I would quietly relinquish everything. Instead, they were forced to acknowledge that my legal position and my composure left them little room for maneuver. I read the letter twice, then set it aside. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I simply recognized it for what it was. Confirmation that truth, law, and self-respect mattered more than theatrics. Weeks turned into months. Life became steady again, but this time with intention. I made small changes. Painting the bedroom walls a softer shade, hanging pictures that reflected my own story rather than anyone else's expectations. I invited friends over, people who offered laughter without judgment. I planted a small herb garden on the balcony, a tiny living reminder that nurturing something, even oneself, is a form of reclamation. I began writing, capturing memories I had tucked away, processing betrayal, love, mistakes, and triumph. Not for Daniel or Lila, not even for the house I left behind, but for me. Words became a way to make sense of the chaos I had endured, to solidify the lessons that were slowly embedding themselves into my being. Then one afternoon Daniel called. Hesitant. A little ashamed, I think. He didn't ask to return. He didn't argue. He simply said, "Mom, I just wanted you to know. See it now. I see everything." I didn't respond immediately. I let the words settle in the room, in my mind, in the years of patience that had led to this quiet reckoning. "Thank you for telling me," I finally said. "I hope it helps you make better choices going forward." He thanked me again awkwardly. Then he hung up. I didn't feel relief or triumph. I felt the subtle, quiet weight of closure, the recognition that people can learn without needing punishment. That I could forgive without forgetting, but forgetting was not required. My life was mine, shaped by choice, not assumption. Some nights, I still dream of the old house. The smell of roast chicken, the echo of laughter, the flicker of light through maple leaves. But these dreams are no longer weighted with anger or loss. They are gentle reminders of resilience, endurance, and the ability to reclaim one's dignity in a world that sometimes forgets to value it. I've learned that betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or confrontation. Sometimes it comes in whispers, in polite smiles, in paperwork disguised as protection. But strength is quiet. Strength is steady. Strength is knowing when to act, when to wait, and when to leave gracefully while still claiming your life. I'm free. Not because they were punished. Not because I sought revenge. But because I remembered my worth. And that, I think, is the true measure of victory. It wasn't long before word of the eviction attempt, and my composed response, spread quietly through the neighborhood. I wasn't broadcasting it. I wasn't seeking sympathy. But houses have ears, and people notice the way someone carries themselves when threatened. Neighbors came by, cautiously at first. I heard, "Are you okay?" one asked. I smiled softly and nodded. The questions weren't invasive, they were human. And I answered honestly, briefly, without indulgence. I didn't need them to take sides. I needed only acknowledgement that the truth had been seen. Some neighbors offered help. A moving truck, extra boxes, even emotional support. Others observed silently. The kind of vigilance born from community bonds. Lila and Daniel were acutely aware. I could see it in the subtle changes in their posture when they crossed paths with neighbors, in the way people stopped by with polite, knowing smiles. The gossip, sometimes unavoidable, worked in my favor. Their assumptions of control began to crumble without my involvement. In a way, the public awareness was a mirror. Not of shame for me, but of the consequences of acting as though another person's home and dignity could be manipulated with silence. Lila and Daniel had underestimated the power of quiet strength, and the community's subtle acknowledgement reminded them of it. The local real estate lawyer called a few days later too. He had heard through channels that Lila and Daniel had tried to sell portions of the property or refinance the house in my absence. "They're treading dangerous water," he warned. "Legally, nothing they've done sticks. And the public awareness only strengthens your position." It was strange, almost poetic, that legality and morality had converged in this way. I had never sought to humiliate or punish them. I simply acted in a measured way, asserting my rights, planning my departure, and ensuring my life would continue without interference. Yet their actions had consequences, social, financial, moral, even though I had not intended them to. When Daniel finally tried to approach me, months later, the conversation was tentative. "Mom, I didn't understand. I thought we were being practical. I didn't realize." His voice trailed off, and I could feel the weight of acknowledgement in his words. I didn't need more than that. Silence can teach as sharply as confrontation. I let the moment linger, then responded with calm clarity. "Practicality doesn't excuse deception. Learn from this, and ensure it never happens again." He nodded, and I let him leave with that understanding. No apology, no demands, no lingering bitterness. Only awareness. That, in itself, was consequence. Lila remained polite, distant. She had realized that my exit had not been forced, and that my dignity remained intact. Any attempt to manipulate, to project guilt, or to provoke anger, fell flat against a foundation of self-possession I had built carefully, deliberately. I watched silently as the tension in her composure deepened, not with fear, but with the recognition that her assumptions no longer carried weight. The community observed, as they always do, but I no longer felt exposed. Instead, I felt respected, not because of public opinion but because of my own choices. Justice had not come through shouting or punishment. It had come through deliberate action, careful planning, and moral clarity. Even legal matters resolved without drama. Lila and Daniel's attempted paperwork manipulations were dismissed formally. The property fully recognized as mine until I voluntarily transferred any part of it. The quiet acknowledgement from law, community, and family created a sense of closure that shouting or revenge could never have achieved. I rebuilt my life deliberately. The apartment became home, but not as a replacement for the house I had left behind. It was a new chapter. I chose furniture and decor that reflected me. I planted herbs and flowers, small living affirmations of growth and autonomy. I invited friends into this space, sharing meals, laughter, and conversation that was mine to command. I joined a book club, started journaling, and spent time in quiet reflection. Every action reinforced that I had reclaimed my narrative. Occasionally, I saw Daniel and Lila from a distance. At community events at the grocery store. There were no awkward confrontations, no public displays of resentment, just awareness, mutual recognition of lessons learned. And silently, I noted their growing respect. Not the respect that comes from fear, but the one that comes from understanding the consequences of actions misaligned with honesty. Months later, I reflected on the sequence of events in my journal. The pages were lined with both sorrow and triumph, lessons and clarity. Betrayal had entered my life quietly, under the guise of paperwork, smiles, and assumed compliance. But strength had emerged quietly too, through patience, planning, and moral fortitude. I had left the house with dignity intact, reclaimed autonomy, and learned that control is not about dominance, but about deliberate choice. I thought often about the maple tree outside my former home, its branches brushing against the windows like old friends. I realized that memories, like trees, remain rooted, even as life shifts. Leaving the house did not erase decades of care, sacrifice, or love. Simply created space for new growth. And so, in the months that followed, I continued. Quietly, deliberately, and intentionally. Life became not about responding to others' assumptions or actions, but about actively shaping my own narrative. The betrayal no longer held power. Only my response did. And I had chosen clarity, dignity, and self-possession. As I sit here now, in a home I chose, surrounded by the life I built for myself, I think about what truly matters when betrayal comes quietly, dressed as kindness or obligation. It isn't revenge, and it isn't proving someone wrong. It's claiming your life back on your own terms, calmly, deliberately, and without losing yourself in the process. I often wonder, how many of us stay silent because we fear confrontation? How many of us assume that enduring quietly is the same as weakness? I learned that silence can be a tool, not a cage. Can buy clarity. It can allow you to act in a way that preserves dignity, teaches lessons, and ensures that you remain the author of your own story. This journey taught me patience. It taught me that strength isn't loud. Strength is measured in quiet actions, in preparation, and in unwavering awareness of your own worth. My son and daughter-in-law thought they could dictate my path. They learned, without harsh words or spectacle, that underestimating someone's resolve is a dangerous assumption. And I learned that even when betrayal cuts deep, peace and autonomy are attainable. I want you to reflect on this too. Think about your own boundaries, the situations where silence has been assumed as weakness, and the moments where clarity and patience might give you more power than anger ever could. Would you have done what I did? Would you have stayed silent, observed, and reclaimed your life on your own terms? Or would you have reacted in anger? Share your thoughts in the comments. I truly want to know. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing to hear more real-life stories of family, betrayal, resilience, and growth. Together, we can learn from each other's experiences and find strength in our shared humanity. The end.